If you read the tea leaves, it is clear that some sort of land swap is going to happen.
What some of these conversations have revealed is the extent to which Russia is interested in trying to pry apart the Americans and the Europeans.
One of the arguments that comes up over and over again is that the reason why we need to contain Putin in Ukraine is that it could spill over into the rest of Europe. Do you actually think that is a possibility? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. It has been a week of extraordinary diplomacy. Donald Trump first meeting Vladimir Putin in Alaska and then Volodymyr Zelenskyy in Washington, D.C., together with his backup band of 7 European leaders. Encounters that could shape the future of the war in Ukraine and America's role in the world. For Putin, it is about legitimacy and legacy. For Zelenskyy, above all, about survival. And for Trump, well, maybe getting that Nobel Peace Prize, but also proving that he is still the master of the art of the deal. To unpack what really happened and what it means for NATO, for Europe and beyond, I'm joined by Emily Ferris from RUSI and William Alberque, an expert on arms control and NATO strategy. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Emily. Is this an exceptional week? Is it an unprecedented week in terms of the kind of weird shuttle diplomacy that we've seen?
I think it is, actually. It's always very tempting, I think, with these sorts of summits to try to divide it into winners and losers and who came out on top. But the very fact that it took place, at least from Moscow's perspective, is enormous. It's a chance to be seated at the table with another great power, to be regarded on an equal footing, which, after all, is what Russia's been wanting for many years. It's a chance to put their perspective across, which they claim is something that's lacking from the conversation. And it's an opportunity, just as you say, to cement Putin's legitimacy as a great leader.
What about you, William? What do you think? Put it into context.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, the fact that the U.S. is meeting face-to-face the president with President Putin is legitimacy he so dearly craves. The fact that the U.S. is negotiating on the behalf of Ukraine without Ukraine in the room is just a really painful thing for Zelenskyy to have to go through. And the fact that all of this may collapse and what we have in the end is some sort of conversation that's happened that could lead to further U.S.-Russia relations, arms control talks, trade deals, what have you, at the expense of Ukraine. So it really is an unprecedented situation as far as I've seen.
Emily, what really struck me when I was in Alaska and then also covering the events in Washington yesterday is that there are 2 negotiations going on here. There's the one between Putin and Trump, or maybe Putin and then eventually Zelenskyy and the European leaders. And then there's the other negotiation that's a daily thing between the Europeans and mostly Zelenskyy and Trump, because the Western camp, as it were, the NATO side, is divided. And there things seem to be changing literally on a daily, possibly even hourly basis. So given the latest summit in Washington and all the really positive mood music and the glad handing and the kind of love fest that we saw, where do you think today those relations, first of all, between the Europeans and Zelenskyy on one side and Trump actually stand?
Well, I think as far as Russia is concerned, the fact that Putin and Trump met first, and they were sort of the big ticket, if you were, and then you have the Europeans scrambling for an audience with Trump and having a conversation completely separately, is something that the Russian press has pointed to with a bit of glee. And they've been talking up, especially since Trump took office, the sort of perceived rupture in the West between European powers and trying to divide NATO into different flanks. And whilst they've been sort of, I suppose, cautiously flattering of the American part of NATO, what they're really trying to do is sow divisions among NATO. And I think what some of these conversations have revealed is the extent to which Russia is interested in trying to pry apart the Americans and the Europeans.
Which has been, you could argue, the policy in Moscow for a very long time. William, are they succeeding in prying apart the Europeans from the Americans? Because it seems to change literally on a daily basis.
It really does. And I mean, the Europeans have been adapting on the fly on how to deal with Donald Trump. I mean, you'll recall in his first term, Jens Stoltenberg was very effective at mitigating the threat of Trump withdrawing from NATO. And this time around, they've been much better. They're so well prepared this time, with Secretary General Rutte flattering President Trump very heavily. And even the fact that they're there, that the European leaders are there with Zelensky, that they're showing support, that they're meeting with Trump, although they've been divided, the very fact that they're there is kind of an extraordinary display of unity that reminds Trump that there are real consequences here. But it's also a signal that the Europeans realize they're going to have to bear the brunt of whatever kind of peace deal, whatever kind of peacekeeping force. They're going to be paying the costs for whatever happens in Ukraine next. And they're making sure that Trump sees that, Trump knows that, they're working together, they're influencing him. I would be far more concerned if they were nowhere to be seen throughout this entire process. The fact that they're actually putting some influence into the situation means we have at least not the worst outcome here, not a great outcome, but we're not seeing the worst outcome, which would be a complete washing of the hands of the United States from Europe or from NATO or from the Ukraine situation. Instead, Trump does seem to be engaged.
Indeed. But William, the price of that engagement is sycophancy or abasement in front of Donald Trump. I mean, it was amazing. I talked to a number of senior European leaders, over the years, and they always laughed at the fact that there was a sort of show of fealty around the cabinet table in Washington, with everyone putting up their hand up and saying, Trump, you're an amazing guy, or Mr. President, sir, you're remarkable. And they were doing exactly the same thing yesterday in the White House. They each had their little preamble, of sucking up to Donald Trump. And that is, I guess, the way it works in the court of King Donald.
Unfortunately, yes. And the fact that they're able to recognize this and they're able to look at what's in their real long-term interest here and to understand that working with Trump requires a certain way of adapting the way you would normally do things. The fact that they're willing to do this shows that they have learned there is an outcome here that they think is possible that would be positive. And again, there was a real fear when Trump came in the second time that he would finish the business of the first term and withdraw from NATO. And the fact that that's not being discussed, that Trump is praising NATO, if the cost of that is, kissing up a little bit, then, and let's face it, the United States has always dominated NATO militarily. The United States has always played the tune. This may be the most naked and distasteful way of showing it, but it's always been in the background of these conversations. And the fact that instead of, Macron saying no and refusing to do so, the fact that he's willing to go along and say, hey, look, this is what we need to do for European security and for the future of NATO. I'm sad and I'm a little bit embarrassed, but I'm also glad that they're working so hard and willing to do anything it takes to maintain this alliance.
Emily, there's, of course, someone else who's playing this bonfire of the vanities game, and that's a guy called Vladimir Putin. I mean, the flattery that he came up with in Alaska on Friday was frankly astonishing. I mean, he repeated all the president's talking points, some of which are frankly loony, from the campaign trail, how the 2020 election was rigged, and if Trump had been president, then there wouldn't have been war in Ukraine. I mean, this is, even by Putin's standards, just kind of jaw-dropping, really. And again, you kind of wonder, who's bigger in Trump's ear? Vladimir Putin, the strong man from Moscow who he probably admires on one level, or all those Europeans, in their varying degrees of English fluency, whispering into his ear. Who is more persuasive, do you think?
Well, I think there's certainly a degree of commonality between Putin and Trump in the way that they sort of, I suppose, admire personalities that are a little bit more brash and perhaps the sort of strongman image. But
well, that's quite a big commonality, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure, Trump likes to shut down free media that criticizes him. Who's done that very effectively for years? One, Vladimir Putin. When it comes to kind of, interfering in the economy, maybe Putin does less of that than Trump would like to do. I mean, there's quite a lot of commonality on one level.
Well, I suppose there's a difference very much between taking personality traits that you find appealing and finding common ways of running a country. I think those are quite different things. But certainly, the fact that Putin is repeating talking points, it's something that Trump has also done with Russia's talking points, most notably. So it's very interesting to see that Trump is sometimes as good as the last thing that he's heard. And sometimes if the last thing that he's heard is something that Putin has said, it can be quite alarming. But I don't think it particularly costs Putin anything to repeat some of the things that Trump was talking about. It was, I think, an exercise in trying to restore the bilateral relationship that didn't require him to make any concessions. It didn't require him particularly to seem weakened. The level of flattery didn't really extend, I think, to anything particularly overly sincere. And then I think the reaction in the Russian media afterwards has been that, yes, there might be a meeting, there might be a trilateral meeting, but they haven't really committed to the fact that Putin would attend. They suggested, well, there might be other more senior leaders in Russia that might come to a meeting between Zelenskyy and Trump. But I think they're trying to kick this into the long grass to see what the Americans might come up with next.
And just, I want to ask you both this question. We spend so much time analyzing the theater and the body language, of Donald Trump and his court and the people around him. And all that is important because those words actually really do matter and the mood can translate into policy. But where we stand right now, what do you think was actually decided in Washington? The nitty gritty of any kind of security guarantee. What do those plans look like? First, you, Emily.
Well, I don't think anything particularly concrete has been decided. And perhaps the reason that it's not been published is that it's in such a sort of febrile state that there isn't really anything to discuss yet. I know it's a little bit of a boring thing to say, but the fact that the meeting took place in and of itself is pretty historic. Russia obviously isn't politically isolated when it comes to its own partners like China and Iran and Belarus and North Korea. But when it comes to the West, this is a pretty big deal that they've sort of scored this audience with Trump. So I wouldn't denigrate too much, perhaps, the fact that it took place and that it might open the door for more conversation. I suppose it just depends the extent to which people think that diplomacy and dialogue can be used as a tool of national security and a tool of foreign policy, rather than something that, as you referred to earlier, is more sort of abasement.
Right. William, it's interesting. I mean, Trump had us all guessing yesterday when he said, again, very much off the cuff, there's a lot of loose talk there about, maybe there'll be, American security guarantees, maybe troops will get involved, maybe not. I mean, again, I was left completely confused by the end of it. What do you think he was actually trying to say, and what does he mean?
Right. I think if you boil it down, if you really parse, if you read the tea leaves, I think what was discussed was, it is clear that some sort of land swap is going to happen. So Russia is going to have some land, but they're going to have to give up some territory that they're currently holding. France, Britain, and Germany can put troops in Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping force, but not under a NATO flag per se. Now, there are hybrid ways to do that NATO has done before, where it's using the tools of NATO for planning and for command and control, but without a NATO flag, with EU leadership instead, which we've done in the Balkans before. He said that Crimea is not being returned to Ukraine. He said accession to NATO is not going to happen, and that the US could help Europe to deploy troops and could even possibly supply some sort of air support. So I think what was discussed was a no-fly zone. I think what was discussed was European troops on Ukrainian soil. I think what was discussed was a security guarantee that would be harder than the Budapest Memorandum, which promised to have a meeting if anything bad happened. This could actually be kinetic if something bad happens. And European boots on the ground will be absolutely essential to any kind of peace and stability. The fact that Trump said those things, and that these aren't things that people interpreted that he said, suggests to me, the way you see him operate, you have a pretty good idea of what was discussed now, and you can see the framework of a peace agreement coming to force. The real question is what's going to happen when Zelenskyy and Putin are in the room together.
Yeah, and that's going to be our next question. But just before that, there was an interesting article by Timothy Snyder, the historian, who is obviously not a Putin fan and not a Trump fan either, saying that the mere wording land swap is incredibly toxic because the Ukrainians have no land to speak of to give back to the Russians after they lost most of Kursk province. So it would be a swap of land for peace and security. But the fact that the Russians are talking about land swaps and the fact that Trump picked that up sort of makes it look as if, there's an equality there of, invasion of territory. And there just simply isn't. And I think that's a really important point, to keep in mind. And so, Emily, I mean, again, because we're so busy trying to work out what, Donald Trump thinks, what we haven't really established yet is how far do you think Vladimir Putin is prepared to compromise?
Well, I think it's right that Putin will probably stop at nothing to subjugate Ukraine ultimately. Whether in the short term there would be some sort of security negotiation with Ukraine that would, so obviously we're not going to go for boots on the ground, but perhaps some sort of intelligence sharing relationship between the Americans and the Ukrainians that endures. some sort of aerial defense patrol, similar, I suppose, to what NATO has over the Baltic states. There was, I think, a lot of wiggle room in some of the security guarantees without it being something so clumsy as sort of soldiers that are posted in Ukraine as a deterrence. But ultimately, the longer term problem is going to be, as you said, that really Putin will not leave it there. It will always be the fact that in the next, I don't know, sort of 5-10 years, when you see perhaps another president in power. I mean, it was very interesting what you pointed to earlier when you noted that that Putin agreed that if Trump had been president at the time, that he maybe would have considered not invading Ukraine. Obviously, we can't know that, but it's a possibility. So if, for example, you have, say, a Democrat president in power, and their position on the Russians is very well known and very negative, I'm sure that you could see an opportunity for the Russians to attempt again, perhaps not something like a military invasion of Ukraine, but certainly over the next 5 or 6 years, you could see them try to invest in their political technologies, as they like to call it, to try to influence election processes in Ukraine, to try to get parties in power that are ultimately favorable to Russia. It will be difficult, but it's certainly something that, given the mistakes that the Russians made in their intelligence assessments of how the Ukrainian people would have responded to an invasion of their country, they thought they would welcome them with open arms. They're going to be doing a lot of, I suppose, revisiting of their own intelligence assessments of how Ukraine works. And it will be interesting to see what they'll throw at it next.
William, I mean, in order to make a deal, whether it's a ceasefire or a lasting peace deal, you do need the Russians to sign that piece of paper. Having raised the stakes in Ukraine, I mean, he calls it a special military operation, but it's everyone knows it's a full-scale war. The Russians have lost up to 1 million men, either killed or maimed. That's a huge number of men that they've lost. And, they've been turned into pariah state as a result of the response, certainly in the West. And for Putin himself, he has said, we've got a Nazi government in Kyiv, which of course is nonsense. Zelenskyy is Jewish, but he has said this is the worst possible threat. If he doesn't get rid of that government, if it doesn't change fundamentally, then in the eyes of his own propaganda, he would have lost that war. So again, I come back to this, we are very good at doing the nuance of security measures here and there, but ultimately, Putin doesn't do nuance when it comes to Ukraine. So where do we meet? Where's the landing strip here?
Look, this is really an extraordinary situation, because if Trump is correct and you're talking about the possibility of European troops in Ukraine and the possibility of some kind of no-fly zone, you're talking about fixing the front line somewhere where Russia does not achieve its war aims. You have to believe that Russia is just going to try to rearm and somehow divide the Europeans and do this again. This is not something that Putin is ever going to stop. He really feels this is an existential threat to his rule. You're right there. Emily is correct as well. This will go on. So what really intrigues me is what's going to happen between Zelenskyy and Putin. It may be that Putin goes in and blows that meeting up, blames Zelenskyy, and then sees if Trump will side with Putin or Zelenskyy at the end of this, and hoping that Trump will side with Putin, blame Ukraine for all of this, and just wash his hands of the whole thing. I think that's got to be Putin's play here, because otherwise he could declare an end to this conflict or cessation of hostilities anytime he wants. He can go home anytime he wants. And I would push back a little bit against what you said. I think Putin could declare victory tomorrow and would just change the propaganda. He has done this so many times during his rule. Oh, whatever I said yesterday, that never happened. How dare you say I said that? This is what I've always said. This has always been the case. He can redefine reality within Russia however he wants. But I do think it would be an incredible weakening of his position of anything less than regime change, or, as you point out, the complete loss of Ukrainian sovereignty. And really what's on the table right now is more of a holding position, like the end of World War II with East and West Germany, or the Baltic states under Soviet control, where we're kicking some of these problems into the long grass with the idea of eventual reunification of Ukraine under Western terms, not reunification of Ukraine under Russian control or as a Russian province. So I do think Putin is losing here. I think he can declare whatever he wants and change the narrative. I think it will weaken him, but he's also, he's also incredibly old as well. I think he's nearing the end of his presidency, his life. I think he wants to.
They're one and the same thing, by the way.
We'll see. Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. Russian presidents don't leave through the door; they get carried off on the door. Yeah, so we'll see. But I do think, I think for Putin, this is existential. He can end it, but he could have ended it at any point. So I do think he's going to try to see this as some kind of pause to rearm and then do it again.
Emily, I want to ask you, broaden it out a little bit. I mean, it was so impressive to see the Europeans all show up in Washington speaking with one voice. That's a remarkable thing for Europe these days, to have a voice. I know that some awkward squad members were not there, like Viktor Orban. But, they've got Meloni on side, who's from the populist right, and then they've got Merz, who's sort of more in the middle, and Macron. I mean, it's an interesting bunch, and they're all talking from the same song sheet, singing even. But one of the arguments that comes up over and over again is that the reason why we need to contain Putin in Ukraine is that it could spill over into the rest of Europe. Now, do you actually think that is a possibility?
I think I'd take some convincing about whether Putin really has designs on the Baltic states. Yes, it was psychologically difficult for Russia to lose the Baltic states to the EU and to NATO. But I think broadly there is an acceptance in Russia that they are part of NATO, and I think Article 5 is very effective as a deterrence. That doesn't mean that Russia is not interested in the Baltic states. They expend a lot of resources, political, financial, and intelligence on penetrating the Baltic states to figure out what's going on, to see if they can influence political parties. And that's much more effective than just, say, a land invasion, something as clumsy as that would generate a third world war. I don't believe that Russia has that interest. Then I suppose there's the more practical aspect of it. So if Russia has failed geographically to conquer Ukraine in terms of territory, which is enormous, there is nothing to lead us to suspect that Russia would be able to do similar in Europe. I know there's lots of, these NATO scenarios about the Suwalki Gap, but this is not really something that Russia really refers to or talks about very much. It's not an area of weakness that Russia is as interested in probing as other things. So trying to figure out NATO's logistical weaknesses, for example. So there's been plenty of attacks on NATO infrastructure in multiple different countries across Europe. It's something that Russia's very keen to distance itself from and use third parties and proxies. But we can pretty much attribute it to Russia's attempt to try to overload NATO infrastructure, things like hospitals and water treatment plants. So it's clear that Russia thinks that trying to distract NATO, prevent it from continuing to arm Ukraine and share intelligence, all of these are sort of worthwhile causes for Russia to spend its time on. But that's a very different scenario than trying to have a sort of territorial takeover of another country. And I think there is a real distinction to be made between the way that Russia sees Belarus and Ukraine and the way that Russia sees other former Soviet territories. Because as we sort of discussed earlier briefly, Russia sees these countries as that kind of triumvirate of, the origin of Kiev and Rus and the heir to this historical Orthodox tradition. That's a very different way of thinking than former Soviet Union territories and trying to reconstitute it. I don't really believe that Russia is interested, for example, in taking chunks out of northern Kazakhstan. The relationship is completely different.
Yeah. William, do you agree with that? Or do you look a little bit doubtful there?
Well, I think the Kazakhs would disagree with that, because you remember when there was the CSTO quote-unquote peacekeeping mission in Kazakhstan and the Russian troops wanted to stay, and you had the unprecedented step of the president of Kazakhstan talking to Putin in Kazakh for the first time that had ever happened in public, to kind of push back against this, what was seen as real Russian revanchism. I do think moving nuclear weapons into Belarus is a part of the broader effort to reabsorb Belarus into a Russian confederation, into what they call the Union State. There were moves with Armenia and Azerbaijan before that conflict re-kicked off, where Russia was trying to position itself with Azerbaijan to put peacekeepers in there right before the war. And now all that's been blown away. So I do think if this war had gone differently, if Ukraine had collapsed immediately as Russia thought it would, Russia thought this was going to be like the Czechoslovakia 1968 campaign and be over in 72 hours. If that happened, I think you would see Putin putting the band back together, putting enormous pressure on Kazakhstan, putting enormous pressure on Armenia and Azerbaijan, absorbing Belarus more politically rather than only militarily. And so then what's the next step? As you've seen with Ukraine, our whole discussion, going back to how you started, Russia wants to take away Ukrainian sovereignty. I think he wants to take away Baltic sovereignty the same way. He wants to take away Finnish sovereignty. He wants none of the countries on his borders to have true sovereignty. Whenever you take down a statue of Stalin, the Russians say, you can't do that. You remember the Russians proposed this big treaty, the European Security Treaty back in 2010, which would have given Russia veto right over domestic legislation in NATO countries. Russia has a very different idea of what sovereignty in its near abroad should be. And I do think they want to see a massive sphere of influence. As to whether it's a territorial invasion or not, I think if Russia thought it could take some NATO territory and break Article 5, show the weakness of NATO, then he would do that. But of course, with the 2014 invasion of Crimea and all the things that NATO has done since then, including putting NATO troops in Eastern Europe on a rotational first and then more on a permanent basis in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, this has sort of taken that move off the table. But I think Russia will continually test where our boundaries are. And if we did not put more NATO troops into the Eastern Front, I do think he would have thought about more of a territorial grab, not to conquer them all per se, but just to show that NATO was hollow. Because ultimately, and again, Matt, I go back to what you started with, Russia's longest term ambition, going back to the Soviet Union, is to decouple the United States and the UK from European security, to sequester them so that he can dominate them. And that's the longer term ambition here.
Okay, a couple of things before we end. Ukraine, right? Whether it's a member of NATO or even the EU at the end of this whole process, whether you like it or not, it is going to become the best armed, the most qualified at warfighting nation, probably anywhere in the world. I mean, these guys are really good at fighting. I know they're tired. They're tooled up to the eyeballs. They have a mission. They're prepared to sacrifice, despite war fatigue setting in and all that. You don't invite them into your tent at your peril, I would say. If you have them outside floating around, who knows who's going to be running Ukraine in 5 years' time? Could Ukraine... Ursula von der Leyen likes to say, it's like swallowing a porcupine. The porcupine swallowed by Russia, but also it could be a porcupine swallowed by Europe or prickling up against Europe, next to Europe in a kind of uncomfortable way.
I do think that Ukraine will integrate more and more into European structures. Certainly, there is much more of a problem in the far east of Ukraine in terms of feeling more Russian and being just, separate in terms of how they think of themselves. I wouldn't concede that as a territorial concession, but I can see the rest of Ukraine integrating very well into Europe. It really was. I mean, the Maidan protest in the first place was a real desire by the majority of Ukrainians to integrate into Western Europe. So I can see this as a long-term project. And you're absolutely right. We shouldn't leave them alone. They have massive capability. We've seen their technological prowess, their ability to develop, even under wartime, amazing technologies, their ability to adapt, their willingness to adopt, great countermeasures against crime and corruption, to take on EU legislation. This was all part of this whole story. And so I do think they will integrate, and leaving them alone, as you're absolutely right, would be a terrible move. It would create this weird badlands in the center of Europe, between Belarus and Ukraine as this sort of ungoverned space with rampant corruption. And that's where we were 10, 15 years ago. We need to take care of this. And I'd say the same thing with Moldova and Transnistria as well. We can't allow these Cold War hangover gaps to exist. We need to integrate more of these territories into a European way of thinking, European business style, European education. And I do think that's the right way forward. And whether it's through the EU or through NATO or some combination, I think it has to happen for Europe's future.
Okay, Emily, just briefly, will Ukraine become a liability or an asset for us in Europe?
Annoyingly, I'm sorry to answer this in such a way. It very much depends on how the war ends. I think it depends on whether this is an enormous defeat for Ukraine. It depends on Europe's willingness to sort of integrate them, as William was saying. But it also depends on the extent to which they're able to root out some of the corruption problems that they do have. The reason that they have been precluded from NATO membership before was not only because there was a war on their territory, but also the corruption problems that William noted earlier. They're really quite systemic. It's very difficult to get out of that way of thinking. And yes, of course, there are European standards that can be imposed. But as some of the processes in Ukraine around their anti-corruption agencies showed only a few weeks ago, it will be a little bit of a damper to those that were hoping that Ukraine might be able to rid itself of some of those elements. So hopefully there will be a strategic plan for integrating Ukraine into structures, because of course what you don't want is the sort of porcupine that you referred to. And you don't want that to be absorbed by Russia or for Russia to take advantage of that chaos as well. So if there is a vacuum that Europe and NATO are not able to fill, you can probably guarantee that Russia will be there to try to absorb some of that discontent and weaponize it against Europe.
Okay, we're going to end with one quick question to both of you. There's a lot of bad that has happened in the last 3.5 years. Lots of lives lost, countries trampled on. Now we have the insecurity, the mercurial nature of Trump's presidency, monarchy, call it what you like. What is the one good thing that has come out of this strange relationship between Trump, Europe, Zelensky and Putin? The one good thing. Emily, you first.
One good thing. Sorry, I can't think of anything.
Okay, all right. Yeah, what about you, William? Is there a good thing?
Yes, I think there is. I think the fact that Europe has woken up to the idea that the world is a dangerous place and that defense matters. I mean, you go back to 2013, the US had removed the last battle tank from Europe. NATO's spending on defense was hovering around 1%. The Japanese had very little spent on defense. Everyone in the West was just thinking, we don't have to take care of these things. And Russia and China and North Korea and Iran did not think that way. And they were arming, we now know that China was well into a nuclear buildup at this point. Russia is, at that point was still 15 years into a major nuclear buildup. And the fact that we were willing to ignore that across Europe, that in the UK, they were talking about, getting rid of nukes, all of this is over. And now we're looking at Europe and the UK really thinking hard about the future of security and that it's based on the traditional things of national power, of cooperation and alliances on top of all that, of solid industrial base, all these kinds of thinking. I think that this is a terrible, dark timeline, but at least you see people waking up and being serious about security, and how to contribute to peace is not through total unilateral disarmament, but through working together to make a stronger future.
Emily Ferris, William Alberque, thank you very much to both of you. I hope you've enjoyed the forecast. See you next time.